We live in a fantasy world now. Reality has been destroyed.
This is the time that you really need to pay attention.
The probabilities are overwhelmingly on gold's side. That is the best environment to see gold increase its value.
Welcome to Palisades Gold Radio. I'm your host, Tom Bodrovics. Joining me today is Brian Gitt, energy entrepreneur, investor, and writer. Thanks for joining me today, Brian.
Thanks, Tom. Looking forward to our conversation.
Me too. And, really starting to dig into a lot of your work. I think a good place to start today's interview was to talk about some of the massive themes that I came across on your website. One thing I try to do on the show is to question where many of the themes that we talk about, where they could be wrong. So you wrote in your background section that thinking and feeling like you're doing the right thing doesn't necessarily mean that you are. And that it took you a long time to admit that many of your beliefs around energy were false because of your sense of identity and self-worth were tangled up with those beliefs. You said, I thought I was doing good and protecting the environment, but I was chasing a fantasy. So the following false beliefs prevented me and others like me from seeing clearly and weighing trade-offs. So there's a couple of topics here that I'd like to outline, and we'll kind of go through them all because there's a ton to talk about here. So those topics that you said that you had false beliefs around were that fossil fuels are running out, modern nuclear power plants are dangerous, solar and wind power with battery storage can replace fossil fuels, electric cars reduce CO2 emissions, and fracking contaminates the water supply and doesn't reduce greenhouse gas emissions. So how did you start to see these topics differently and begin to change your mind on all of these ideas?
Well, when I started failing a lot and when reality really starts hitting back, then you kind of have to wake up. I guess you don't have to. You could double down and continue against the opposition there. But I think questioning your beliefs is the most important skill that investors need, that humans need of any type if we're going to productively move forward. But I would say especially investors. And, one of the most painful parts of this experience is I ended up losing a lot of money. I had started a software company. I had put a bunch of money into it, both investor money, my own money. And when you have a hypothesis and it fails and you lose a lot of money, it's a wake-up call. It really made me reflect on, how did I make this decision? What were my assumptions that were driving this? How was I so wrong about this hypothesis and what I was trying to do? And it really sent me down the rabbit hole of understanding the literature that's existing on decision science. There's actually decades of literature that exists on this, of how you overcome your biases, how do you question your beliefs, and how do you really think clearly? Because thinking clearly, whether you're an investor or in any business endeavor, is just essential. So that was a hard-won lesson. I wish I didn't have to lose as much money as I did and have to fail as hard as I did. But, sometimes those kind of consequences can be the wake-up call that you need. And for me, they were.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it's interesting as you're talking about that, really revealing your biases and questioning your beliefs. And you said trying to think clearly. There's actually a book by that name, The Art of Thinking Clearly, that goes through all of that stuff. I don't know if you've ever read it, but it's a great book for anybody to really get a handle on exactly, revealing their own biases.
Yeah, I'll have to check that one out. I haven't read that book. I've read a lot in that space. Daniel Kahneman's very famous in the space, but Thinking Fast and Slow. Mm-hmm. Annie Duke in her books about decision making. There's a lot of folks that are writing about this and just kind of exposing a lot of the research and literature that's out there. But I found it incredibly helpful because they're very specific frameworks and tools you can use to really just make better decisions in life and in business.
Mm-hmm. So let's start breaking down some of these topics. Let's start with the fossil fuels are running out. So what about your belief at the time was incorrect?
So I shared this belief, which many people in industry as well as government have shared over the decades. I mean, this is kind of a pattern that goes back throughout history. We constantly think we're running out of fossil fuels, but we always overlook the innovation and technology that drives progress forward. And there's just this pattern that keeps repeating itself over and over. But when you read all the news headlines, and whether it's financial media or just mainstream media, you're constantly bombarded with this whole peak oil, peak gas narrative that we're running out, these resources are constrained. And the reality is, when you really zoom out and think about it, 90% of all the fossil fuels on this planet are going to be in the ground in a million years. I mean, it's just an incredible reservoir. Now, not all of this obviously is accessible to us from a financial standpoint today, or some of it is out of our range of using our current technology today. But there's no doubt we don't have a scarcity of fossil fuels. So really, it's all the issue of price and technology is what's driving ultimately our ability to harness and pull out more resources out of the ground. And so I'm not trying to overstate it, because we do have some, supply issues in different parts of the world. Obviously, it's not all created equal, but I held this myth. I believed it very much to my core that no, this was a constrained resource. We were running out. There wasn't going to be any more, no matter what technology innovations were going to happen. And therefore, we must change. We must transition to renewable energy, mainly wind and solar power. And that was a deeply held belief that I had that was just incorrect. It's not only factually incorrect, but it's actually an incredibly inefficient technology. When you start transitioning to low power density technology such as wind and solar, the energy return on energy invested is incredibly poor. So when you look at something like nuclear power, you're getting like 100 to 1 in terms of the amount of energy you put in to amount of energy you get out, versus solar and wind, it's like 3.5 to 1. It's a 30x difference. So you're getting you have to invest 30x more energy to get per unit out in a solar or wind technology versus nuclear. So, and gas and oil around 30 to 1 ratio. So they're much, much better, obviously, but they're not nearly as good as nuclear as well. So all of these things have to be thought about and taken into account.
Well, there's a lot to get to in that answer, and you covered kind of a couple of my other points there. But when we think about the idea that there aren't going to be any more fossil fuels, or that it is running out, is it just really a function of incentivized pricing to help drive technology and innovation in this space, and to be able to balance that energy return on energy invested equation?
Price is paramount, obviously. That's what drives the investment cycle. However, it's not everything, because we have a narrative that we have to contend with as well. The environmental social governance narrative, ESG, has been pervasive in the culture the last few years. And what we've seen is a significant shift of capital that was going into oil and gas sector that has shifted out of it. Right. And that's pretty clear. And that's why we have massive underinvestment, even though the price has spiked. I know it's down a little bit right now, but over the last several months, we've had incredibly high gas and oil prices. And yet you don't see the level of investment. You don't see all of these companies jumping in to go drill and expand and continue exploration at the same frenetic pace that they were doing, let's say, a decade ago. Not at all. Now, that is a complex answer, because some of it is that, a lot of these companies weren't the best disciplined fiduciaries with the money, right? They overdrilled a lot of cases and blew up a lot of investor money. So I'm not to say that the industry doesn't have some blame in this as well. They do. So you have these converging factors of basically investors lost a ton of money in the oil and gas sector over the last decade or so. You have this ESG narrative that is basically forcing various asset managers and lenders to move away or shift, or at least limit the amount of capital that they're willing to deploy into new projects and development. And then, we have the constraints of technology as well, right? I mean, we're constantly innovating, we're constantly evolving, but, no one saw the shale boom revolution around the corner. I mean, that was something that took a lot of iteration, many years of dedication and hard work. George Mitchell and his team and many of the other energy entrepreneurs that brought that shale revolution to fruition. That was not the mainstream view. I mean, we thought we were running out of natural gas. We were building LNG import facilities in the United States because we thought we were going to have to import it. And then in a few short years, that flipped 180 degrees. And now we're the largest exporter of natural gas liquids in the world, right? And that's just an amazing transformation in a very short period of time, showing the power of technology and innovation and entrepreneurship. And when you give people economic freedom to be able to pursue that, they're going to come up with amazing new ideas and implement those ideas.
Mm-hmm. One of the ideas that I've had previous guests of the show bring up is that the shale industry would never have really been able to be as successful as it was or really exist at all without the amount of credit that they used and really, as you kind of said, burnt through. So when we look at that from the EROI standpoint, was that an efficient use of energy and capital at the time? And what is the sustainability of that market going forward?
I think, markets correct themselves, right? I mean, you have these boom bust cycles, all commodities go in these patterns. And so I think they do correct. It's just, what is the time frame or the time horizon we're looking at? That's really, I think, a critical piece of this. And as an investor, you gotta obviously know where you are in the cycle. But I do think it is a self-corrective. I mean, the reason human beings are the apex predator on the planet is because we are an incredibly adaptive species. We constantly are adapting and fine-tuning and kind of sensing where things are changing. And as long as there's freedom to do that, it will correct. Now, that doesn't mean you can't lose a ton of money. You could light a bunch of money on fire in the process. You can, but we do self-correct. Intelligence, to me, the definition of intelligence is error correction. So therefore, we should give people as much freedom and flexibility to error correct as quickly as possible.
Mm-hmm. That's a great point. So, we speak about a lot about nuclear energy on this channel. So what do you think is the biggest hurdle for the nuclear energy space? And, maybe this applies to the ESG push in general as well. You're of course in California, where one of the nuclear plants in California, Diablo Canyon, has been up for debate whether or not to shut it down or extend its lifespan. So is changing public opinion, you think, that maybe the biggest hurdle for all of these industries?
I think the biggest hurdle is regulation. I think public opinion is incredibly important to shaping new policy and to ultimately impacting regulation. But I think right now the biggest threat to the nuclear industry is regulation. Overregulation, basically. Now, I'm not of course, we need safeguards. We need a certain level of regulation for some very powerful technology like nuclear. So I'm not saying laissez-faire, just let it all figure itself out, obviously. But we've gone so extreme and basically almost criminalized it and made it so difficult to build. It's become, the United States is a great example of this. The Nuclear Regulatory Commission has not actually approved and licensed a new power plant since the agency came into existence in the 1970s. So that should tell us something right there. We're not moving forward, right? How can you iterate on a technology? How can you drive down costs if you can't build anything?
How can you increase safety?
Right. You have to be able to iterate. You have to be able to move and have the freedom and flexibility to do that. And unfortunately, in the United States, we've basically clamped down on it so hard that we've limited the ability for the industry to iterate on these designs and test different things. Now, of course, we need the safeguards and the safety plans in place, but a lot of other countries are doing this. I mean, and even the US, we did this. 20% of the electricity in the United States today is powered by nuclear power plants. Over 100 million Americans live or work within 50 miles of a nuclear power plant, right? So this is not a brand new technology that we don't understand. It's powering a fifth of all of our energy today in the electricity space. And it's something we're very familiar with, and it has the test of time. I mean, nuclear power is the safest way to generate electricity, bar none. If you look at it from a statistical perspective, from a data perspective, in the US, out of 60 plus years of commercial operation, not a single person, not a single human being has died due to nuclear radiation at a US power plant. So what are we even talking about? We've had one accident. I'm not trying to minimize accidents. You got to be incredibly careful. Any accident should be taken very deadly seriously, but you have to look at the gravity of it in comparison. We have all kinds of industrial accidents all the time. Chemical companies, whether it's a paint manufacturing facility, et cetera. I mean, in the oil and gas sector, there's lots of accidents that happen. You want to minimize those as much as humanly possible. But the reality is the safety record of the nuclear industry is bar none, the best and the safest. And we really haven't had any huge problems with it. Now, globally, we've had two other incidents besides 3 Mile Island here, which I just referenced. But even those statistically showed that nuclear is safe. I mean, Fukushima, as horrible as it was as a disaster, only one person actually died of radiation related death or exposure, supposedly. And he was a smoker and he died of lung cancer. So that's even somewhat contested. So, yes, these are terrible incidents. But in Chernobyl, the worst of them all, the conditions that that plant was operating under, nuclear plants don't operate under those conditions today. They didn't have containment dome. They didn't have many of the things that we would not even contemplate today. And even in the worst accident in history, we're talking about, including the cancer-related deaths, we're talking about 200 people that have died as a direct connection with the Chernobyl incident over all these decades. So we have to keep things in perspective. It's the same reason people are more scared to sometimes fly in a plane versus to drive in their car. We know that airplanes are way statistically safer than driving. About 40,000 people in the US die in car accidents every year. It's incredibly rare that a plane goes down, you're not going to die in a plane. I mean, it's just almost unheard of anymore. So these are the kinds of conversations we need to have, and we need to go looking at the data to inform these kinds of decisions and not be guided by emotion.
Mm-hmm. I recently had Mark Nelson on. He's a real nuclear advocate. And he brought up the idea that the petroleum industry was actually partly to blame because they were helping kind of shape public opinion against nuclear. So is that an idea that you've ever come across and you think that contributes to the problem of the perception of, anti-nuclear?
I think that might have been true in the past. I'm sure it was true. Hey, business is competitive. What business isn't competitive? Nuclear does compete with other energy sources, whether it be solar, wind, natural gas, et cetera. So, I mean, yes, I think the oil and gas industry, I'm sure at different points in time, has had an impact on the overall kind of growth of nuclear. However, I don't think that's really what's happening today. I don't think that's what's the limiting factor. I think the public perception is way off the mark in terms of the actual risk factor. And I actually would put way more blame on the environmental community than I would the oil and gas community for where we are today. In terms of the discussion today we're having on the national and state level, I don't hear a lot of strong voices in the petroleum industry talking about nuclear power. What I hear is a lot of the environmental activists that are basically conflating nuclear power with nuclear weapons. I hear them trying to promote these myths that have been perpetuated for decades now about the danger of nuclear power. That's absolutely not true. So I think the environmental activists are a much bigger threat to nuclear today, although in the past, I'm sure the petroleum industry had its influence.
Mm-hmm. So, one of the biggest arguments against nuclear, of course, is what to do with the waste once that fuel is used. So how do you see this problem? And do you think that there are any new technologies that you're aware of that can help solve this problem?
I don't think nuclear waste is an unsolved problem. I think we've already solved it. We can debate what that means, but we put it in dry casks that are made of concrete and steel, and they've safely been sitting there for decades. Not a single human being on the entire planet has had any negative health effect, much less dying from nuclear waste. Zero, none. So what is the risk exposure? I mean, we dispose of all kinds of really toxic chemicals that end up going into the groundwater and have other effects. We don't have any of those risk factors with the way we're storing this waste today, right? It is completely a safe way to store it. Now, there are technologies that are looking to innovate on this. And for example, there's a company called Deep Isolation that uses directional drilling and borrows the technology from the fracking industry and from the oil and gas industry to basically go down, 1-2 kilometers down into the earth and then go either on a slant or go horizontal. So they take these canisters and they basically use the lines to lower those into the earth in these geologic formations that have basically no water has moved through them in a million years. And then the actual canisters that these things are made of special alloys to encase the spent fuel, and they can retrieve it. If they want to pull it up in the future, and if there's a reason to pull it up, you could retrieve it in the future. But basically, it's stored miles below the surface, well below the water table. So there are technologies that are emerging that can cost effectively have deep geological storage for this. It's just really a political issue. I mean, the whole Yucca Mountain thing in the US, it was a big disaster, right? We spent all this money, all this time, and now politically it's blocked from happening. But the reality is we already store nuclear waste safe everywhere. It's stored. We have it at hundreds of sites around in the United States. We've actually moved nuclear waste by a truck, by a rail, by ship thousands of times. Most people aren't even aware of it. It's happening. There hasn't been a single incident or a single problem with all of those transports. So we're already moving it. It's already stored. It's already safe, right? Can we continue to innovate and find new and better ways? Of course, and we will. Like deep isolation is a great example of that. But I think, quite frankly, I don't think we even need to store it deep in the earth. I think it can be stored very safely above ground, and certainly would be a lot cheaper. So there's always trade-offs in all of these things. And you have new reactor designs that are actually using the spent fuel coming out of the large reactors as an input, as fuel in these advanced reactors that then take something that would be radioactive for hundreds of thousands or potentially millions of years down to a couple hundred years, right? Because it's basically recycling that spent fuel and using it. So I think we have a multi-pronged approach to solve this problem. One is let's try to recycle as much of the spent fuel as possible in these advanced reactors. Mm-hmm. Let's make sure we're storing it, obviously, as we are safely here above ground. And let's innovate. Let's come up with new technologies like deep isolation and others to look for longer term on the order of hundreds of thousands of years or millions of years. But why do we don't need to solve a problem a million years from now. I mean, we can solve the problem for the foreseeable few hundred years. And that's assuming like there's no innovation that's going to happen over the over the next 50 to 100 years. That's kind of crazy to me. I mean, we're constantly innovating, constantly getting better. And we're going to come up with new and better ways. But even today, it is safe today, even if we did nothing.
Mm-hmm. So that was actually somewhere I wanted to go next was, you kind of have a background in the venture capitalist side of things. So I was wondering what parts of the nuclear industry to you are, real interesting and exciting technological innovations that are coming up, whether they be SMRs, reactors that are using spent fuel from larger reactors. Where do you think the biggest, let's say, bang for the buck innovation-wise is coming in that space?
Well, I'll answer the question in two ways. Because first of all, I think we need all different size nuclear plants. We need the really large light water reactors that we have today. We need mid-size, we need small scale and micro plants. The energy industry is massive. It's a $2 trillion plus industry. It's bigger than consumer electronics and all of these other huge industries combined, right? It is the largest industry in the world. And therefore, you're going to need a whole range of technologies to solve this problem. It's not a one size fits all. Mm-hmm. So we definitely need the very large centralized plants that we have today, like in the US, light water reactors that are like a gigawatt plus. We need those, and we need to build those and certainly maintain and extend the licenses of the existing ones. But we also need to innovate on the small reactor side, because there's a bunch of applications that those can be utilized for. Let's say data centers, right? One of the biggest energy hogs that we have today, and it's growing exponentially, is Google, Microsoft. All of these big companies are building out all of these data centers, because every time you go on the internet and you search for something, or every time you use software, it's constantly pulling more and more power. And as we move to using machine learning, artificial intelligence more and more, which obviously trending, that's the way we're going, the power demands are just increasing dramatically. So we also need solutions that could be located on site at a data center. And there are solutions at that scale so that you could provide an on-site solution to power that whole data center, or put something at the chemical factory that's making petrochemicals, or put something at a military base. So there's a whole range of applications that we need to solve for that span the whole spectrum. So we can't get into you sometimes hear in the nuclear industry or in the space, you get all these arguments against, oh, small reactors are a waste of time, or big reactors take too long and we shouldn't build them. We just should do small. I mean, there's all these arguments. The truth is we need it all. We need the full spectrum of technologies. And we need to remove the barriers, as much of the overregulation as fast as possible, so we can have all these entrepreneurs out there working to build a lot of new innovation and different designs, and also supporting the large scale expansion as well. We are seeing a dramatic shift that's happened even in the last couple of years or so with respect to nuclear power on the global stage. We've seen countries like Japan, that obviously due to the accident had almost fully divested, to now they're restarting a bunch of their reactors. I think it's 9 or maybe 10 of them. They're restarting in the near future. You have South Korea.
By this winter, right?
Yeah, by this winter. You have the UK is now moving forward with 8 new reactors. You have India that is building 10 new reactors, and they're building them kind of bulk style. So they're going to build them so they can get the economies of scale on the components in the ordering, et cetera. So, and that they're going to be moving forward quickly. So you have all these countries around the world, whether it's France, UK, South Korea, Japan. Obviously, China is investing hugely. They have massive plans to build like 150 reactors over the next 15 years. So we have a lot of momentum now in this direction. Unfortunately, it's not in the United States. It's all in these other parts of the world.
So, is it possible that the economics for the US, considering the shale boom that we had, that is playing a big incentivizing role in which of these energy markets are being rewarded?
Well, economics, absolutely. But economics are downstream of regulation. The only reason the economics are bad is because the regulation is bad, right? I mean, if it takes you a decade to basically get something licensed and permitted, the capital costs, the carrying costs on that is just massive. And to build these things is that it's elongated out. So to comply with all the regulatory barriers. So you can't de-link those. Yes, it is very expensive to build anything in the United States today. We're not building everything. We build a bridge or build a highway, or any kind of energy infrastructure. Everything is so expensive. We had a big train project here in California that we were spending wasted billions on, and then they're even stopping it. So, I mean, the whole country, unfortunately, is buckling under this overregulation framework that has been pushed and layered on. And nuclear is a great example of it, but it's not the only example.
Mm-hmm. So the next theme that you mentioned was that solar and wind power with battery storage can replace fossil fuels. And as I was reading through some of your work, I was thinking about the energy density of oil and uranium versus the density of electricity as stored in batteries. So how do you see that problem? You brought up that density idea earlier, and I wanted to get back to it.
So the world has invested about $2.7 trillion with a T, trillion, over the last decade plus. Let's just be generous and say over the last 20 years. And the world has gone from 87% use of fossil fuels to power the world to 84%. So we basically barely moved the needle after almost $3 trillion spent on these technologies. Now you have to, at some point, you have to reflect. You got to sit back and go, okay, so we're spending all this money, we're deploying this technology, but we're not moving the needle hardly at all on the energy consumption side. And ultimately, it's because solar and wind farms don't replace power plants. It's that simple. They don't replace them. When you just look at the underlying physics of how it works, they are intermittent energy sources. We all know, and the pro-renewable folks hate it when I say things like this, the wind doesn't always blow and the sun doesn't always shine. But I mean, come on, that is such a huge limitation of this technology. And we have not solved the battery storage problem or the storage problem in general. Mm-hmm. Even in the best case, I'm sitting here in California, solar here is the dominant renewable power source. It's about 24% capacity factor, which means it's generating power maximum power about 24% of the time. That's in sunny California. So it's, less than a quarter of the time, even in the sunniest state we have In the Union, we're still only generating it versus you mentioned Diablo Canyon, a nuclear power plant in Southern California, is about 92% capacity factor. So when you look at the difference of the overall efficiency and productivity of these technologies, they're just massive. And that's just on the output side. So if you start translating that to other climates, taking a place like Germany, who has run this experiment more than any country on earth, Germany has spent over $500 billion or equivalent euros on this wind and solar fantasy since the year 2000. They started the Innovate, which is their big energy transition plan. And what have they gotten for it? Well, they've over doubled the cost of their electricity. That's not working out too well, especially right now. They divested and restricted other energy sources such as fracking and natural gas exploration because they said, well, we can't do that. We got to go all in on solar and wind. And then they started divesting from nuclear and shutting down their nuclear plants. And then they became very reliant on Russia for importing natural gas because they weren't developing that infrastructure themselves and they weren't fracking and developing natural gas, or they weren't building the LNG import facilities so they could import liquefied natural gas from other countries. Now they are, now that their back is against the wall and that their entire industrial sector is potentially facing a collapse in the near term as we move into the winter. I mean, it is incredibly dire right now. I just was in Germany. I was traveling with Michael Schellenberger. We went to the Netherlands to cover some of the Dutch farmer protests. And then we went to Germany and we had a number of meetings with various trade associations and businesses and media and lots of different folks in Germany. And I have to say, I am very fearful for what is going to happen this winter in Germany. You know, Germany is the industrial sector of Europe. It's basically the beating heart of industry in Europe. And Europe relies on Germany, both financially as well as just as that industrial sector. And you can't run this. Factories are already either rationing or halting operations or limiting operations to certain hours. When you run a factory that way, you lose money. If you lose money, you have to let all the workers go and you're not creating product. It's pretty basic unit economics, supply and demand here. What they're facing is severe rationing. And basically, because the government doesn't want to shut down everyone's energy in your house, you want people freezing to death in their homes, they're going to lean more on industry, right? A lot of these factories, though, if you're an aluminum or steel or glass factory or ceramics, these things, they need to run 24/7, 365. You can't shut them down. If you shut them down, the equipment breaks. It's not like you can just turn it off, flip a switch. So what you're talking about is catastrophic for certain industries in this sector. And it's not just, certain types of businesses, like if you're a Bitcoin miner or something, you can just shut it off. If you're aluminum smelter, you can't just shut it off, or glass factory. So these things are going to have huge implications and have big ripple effects in terms of the economy throughout Europe.
So as we're talking about this density standpoint, obviously this is really the first time in history we've ever moved to a less efficient source of energy. And, as we think about the density equation, how much land does wind and solar require to produce versus the alternatives?
Oh, they're really not space efficient at all. So for example, if we're going to compare, we got to always compare two things, right? So if you're going to compare building a nuclear plant versus a solar plant requires 75 times more land than a nuclear plant. A wind farm would require 360 times more land than a nuclear power plant. To give another example, let's just take a wind farm, like a 200 megawatt wind farm, that would require about 13 square miles of land. The same amount of power that was generating, a natural gas power plant could basically sit in a single city block, right? So the power density matters. The overall efficiency of these technologies matter a lot in terms of their environmental impact. Because when we're talking about the environment, you can't just think about CO2. Now, CO2 is a concern, obviously, but it's not the only concern. We have lots of concerns. We have all different types of pollution. We have all different types of problems in the world we need to focus and solve. We can't put all of our resources, all of our time, all of our focus on one of them and ignore everything else. So it's a really important fact. Right now, we've been caught up in this. I would almost call it a mania right now. It's just this doomsdayism of the sky is falling and basically the world is ending in 12 years due to climate change. And it's just not true. I mean, when you look at the data, you look historically, deaths from natural disasters over since the late 1800s have basically plummeted over 95%. So when you add up hurricanes, fires, tornadoes, all of the various natural droughts, all of it together, people are way safer than they used to be from natural disasters. So yes, climate change is a concern, but first of all, it's getting less risky, not more risky, due to innovations in technology and our resilience. And we have to consider the trade-offs and the opportunity costs of not investing in these other technologies. Because if we're putting, like right now, we just passed the new legislation in the US, the so-called Inflation Reduction Act, which it's amazing to me that something is called inflation reduction when we're basically printing a bunch of money to spend money on mostly inefficient technologies that raise the cost of energy. And that's just a fact. I mean, you look at people talk all the time about solar and wind is the cheapest form of energy, but that's absolutely not true. It's not an apples and apples equation. When you look anywhere in the world that solar and wind have a significant level of penetration on the grid, the prices are higher because there's all of these system costs. There's all the voltage, the storage, the land use, the tax, all of these other costs are involved that aren't getting ascribed to that number. So I know we're talking around this issue a little bit about how inefficient these technologies are, and we're talking about storage because the solution that is proposed to this intermittency problem with solar and wind is, well, battery storage or other types of new energy storage. But let's look at Germany as a good example again, because they spent all this money on this. They did a study. They went back 35 years and looked at historical data on an hourly interval basis. So I'm not talking about models projecting the future or anything like that. I'm talking about real data. And what they found was over these 35 years that you would have to overcome through various cloudy days and wind droughts and just not having enough sun, different seasons, you would have to overcome 64 days of inadequate resource, meaning there's just not enough wind or sun at a stretch. And what that would mean in terms of battery storage, like how much battery storage would you need to build? It was 24 days of battery storage. So think about that. 24 days of stored energy to overcome some of the seasonal variation and differences in Germany, because in Germany, the capacity factor of solar is 12%, right? So 12% of the time it's working, generating maximum power, though that's not really efficient. I mean, it's an inappropriate technology for a northern latitude country like Germany. You want to put solar in Arizona? Fine. Go put solar in Arizona. That at least makes some sense. But putting solar in northern latitude cities and countries makes absolutely no sense. And especially because they have short winter days. They have, oftentimes, you'll have like we had in Europe last year. You can have a wind drought the last 6 months. The wind production was way off. It was like 30% down in the UK last winter than what it was supposed to do due to a wind drought. But you can't run modern civilization on an intermittent power source. It is not possible, right? So you have to have the storage. And that types of storage that would have to overcome those seasonal challenges and basically in the winter and most of the world is not even something that is on the table. I mean, it's the economics of it. It's not even worth doing the calculation because it would be so many trillions of dollars more than the entire economy. So what are we even talking about? These are not, no one serious that is looking at this challenge is proposing that we use batteries to back up the grid. It is not a viable technology in its current form to do that. Now, batteries can have a role on the grid. I'm not against batteries. Batteries are great. I have a phone. I have a car. I mean, I love batteries. They make my life better. But don't misappropriate the technology for an application that it's not intended to do. And batteries on the grid right now they're rated about 1 to 4 hours. So yeah, batteries can be useful to it when you're hitting peak load, when everyone's coming home from work and they're all starting to cook and get in the house and using all their appliances. If you want to have batteries to overcome as you shift off things like solar or wind to cover that period of time for a few hours, then yeah, batteries can play a role in that, but they're not replacement. right? They're not going to replace the need for fossil fuels. Another thing that often gets overlooked with this is that you're going to need some type of power plant to back up these renewables, right? As I just illustrated. But you can't just turn these power plants down to zero or down to 10%. There's a minimum running factor that they have to do. So let's just take a natural gas plant. I was just looking at a study that the California Energy Commission did in California. And what this study showed is that the plants, really their minimum operating capacity is about 50%. So you can't really run a natural gas plant much under that. Otherwise, you're going to not, basically what they need, they have to burn enough fuel to keep the temperature up and to keep momentum within the power plant. So you can't just turn it off and then turn it on and wait for the cloud to move and then turn it on again. I mean, it doesn't work like that. These things take hours to ramp up and down. And that is even, when we're talking about combined cycle natural gas plants. Now, there are certain peaker plants that are designed to ramp up quickly, but they're incredibly expensive and they don't burn fuel efficiently, right? If we're wanting to, ultimately, what are we trying to do? We're trying to reduce emissions. Ultimately, if this is the goal of solar and wind, oftentimes you're emitting more emissions, not less, by ramping up and down the power plants. It's just like your car. If you're driving highway miles versus city miles, if you're going to stop, start in the city, you're going to burn fuel inefficiently. Same thing with a power plant. If you're going to ramp it up and ramp it down, you're going to end up burning more fuel and emitting more emissions, not less.
So, when we kind of contrast these two different sources of energy and we think about the waste from nuclear, there's also a component of waste from solar and wind as well, is there not?
Nuclear has 300 times less waste than solar, as an example. Solar has huge amount of waste because, first of all, because of the low density, you need a ton of surface area. You need lots and lots of millions and millions of solar panels. Mm-hmm. Well, solar panels also don't last that long. They're usually warranted for 20, 25 years, depending on the brand and the manufacturer. They also degrade over time, so they get less and less efficient over time. But let's just say 20, 25 years is the life of a solar panel for these commercial applications. Well, then you have to get rid of it. So basically, a nuclear plant can run comfortably 60 to 80 years. They can easily be maintained and expanded. They could run even 100 years. There's no reason it can't, as long as it's maintained well. So, but let's just say the 80 years. So a nuclear plant's going to last 4 times as long as that solar farm that you built, right? So you're going to have to build and throw away the solar farm 4 times over to equate to what the nuclear plant could do with the initial investment in materials. So these things are incredibly materials rich in terms of the level of investment needed. They need like 18 times more materials to build a solar farm up front. So you got to mine all that stuff all the way just to throw it away in a very short period of time. Now, some proponents of solar and wind talk about, well, we'll just recycle it. Well, that's not happening in most of the world, but even in the United States, it's not happening because it's not cost effective. We know the reason why we don't recycle most things is because it's more expensive to do it, because you have to build that infrastructure and processing, and it's just cheaper to go mine and get the virgin material. So then if you're going to add all this recycling infrastructure, you're going to have to increase the cost, right? It's going to pass on to the business or the consumer that's paying for it. So it's going to get even more expensive than it is today. And the problem with what's happening today is they're thrown oftentimes in landfills and other places that aren't properly disposed of. And so these things are made with toxic chemicals. There's all types of heavy metals that can leach out of these broken solar panels and potentially contaminate groundwater, right? So they actually are a much bigger threat. The waste, solar waste, is a much bigger threat than nuclear waste, because nuclear waste at least is very small and it's very contained. It's so concentrated. Like all the nuclear waste in 70 years of commercial operation in the United States could fit on a single football field stacked 10 yards high. So imagine that. One football field, 10 yards high, all the waste from 70 years from about 100 nuclear power reactors supplying 20% of the energy in the US, right, of all that time, is stored on that one football field. All right. Now, when we talk about solar, we're talking about 300 times the amount of waste that isn't getting recycled, that isn't stored in one place. It's getting tossed in landfills and potentially leaching into the groundwater, the various toxic chemicals and components of it. So solar waste is a much bigger problem than nuclear waste for those reasons.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's crazy to think that there are all of these different problems with quote unquote renewables that are just being sold to us as green and safe and the solution to all of the problems of energy systems of the past kind of thing.
Yeah, I mean, we have to look at this problem from first principles, and as you brought up in the beginning, looking at from a physics perspective and energy density, we've been on this march for centuries to increasing the power density and harnessing higher concentrated forms of energy. So, we started off burning wood, and wood is one of the most polluting sources. It's so-called natural, but you have to cut down. We were cutting down all the forests on the planet to basically run industry and to keep ourselves warm. That's not a very environmental product. Wood is not an environmental product. So then we moved to coal. Coal ended up saving the forests, right? I mean, people don't think about it, but it's true. I mean, if we didn't move to coal, all the forests would be gone, right? And all the animals, all the natural habitat that goes along with it. So coal had a huge positive environmental impact as well as the externalities. All these energy sources have trade-offs, every one of them. Mm-hmm. Nuclear, natural gas, solar, wind, geothermal, et cetera. Everything has trade-offs. The challenge is, how do you weigh the trade-offs and then choose the ones that are going to basically produce the most value for the minimum emissions and the minimum amount of pollution? And clearly, natural gas and nuclear rise to the top in that evaluation because they are the most power dense and they are the cleanest burning and they use the least amount of land and they generate the most amount of power to accomplish the goal. So we have to zoom out sometimes and think, okay, what are we trying to do? What is the goal? I think the goal is we want to protect and improve the quality of people's lives, right? And we want to protect and improve the quality of our environment. That's the goal. So what is the technology? What is the energy source that helps us most achieve that goal? Why are we picking winners or focusing narrowly on one specific type of pollution or one thing instead of looking comprehensively? And unfortunately, it's the developing world that is paying the price of this, and under the boot of basically the World Economic Forum and a lot of the international organizations that are restricting investment in energy infrastructure. So they're not wanting to finance power plants and pipelines, for example, in Africa, under the false premise that somehow that's going to significantly move the needle on reducing CO2 emissions. So they're basically forcing people to live in poverty and not being able to develop economically so they can virtue signal and feel good about themselves. I mean, this is clearly unethical, I think is just a travesty. Meanwhile, their whole economy runs on fossil fuels, right? 84%, again, of the world's energy is based on fossil fuels. So the people that are using fossil fuels for all the comfort, for all the prosperity, for all the things they love in their life and are taking advantage of, are preventing the poorest people on the planet from accessing the energy they need to flourish and grow as a civilization. I think that's really just a horrible thing.
Yeah, and going back to that, when you said that we moved away from fossil fuels by 3%, did the renewables gain 100% of that 3%?
Yeah, that 3% is basically representative of the solar and wind number.
Okay.
Yeah.
So the next point was that electric cars reduce CO2 emissions. So what part of that premise is false? So is it mostly just that it matters where that power is coming from to charge those electric cars?
Electric vehicles shift the emissions from the tailpipe to the power plant, right? It's not like a magical machine that all of a sudden there's no emissions anywhere. There are emissions, it's just in a different location. Now, I'm not an anti-electric car. I think there could be innovations in electric vehicles that make perfect sense, but we're not there yet, right? The power density of batteries is not there. We need a breakthrough in battery chemistry to really usher in a clean solution in this. So we have multiple issues with electric cars. Let's start with the emissions, though. So there was just a report out in China recently, just about a year ago or so, that showed that the emissions from electric vehicles were in some cases more than conventional vehicles. Now you'd say, well, what are you talking about? How's that possible? Well, because if you're burning inefficient, dirty coal, in parts of China and using that power to power your electric vehicle, then you're actually increasing the overall emissions versus if you were just burning gasoline in a average car. Right. So, and I'm not talking about a super efficient car, et cetera. This was just looking at two kind of similar type cars. What they were showing is the emissions profile of the electric vehicle was higher in certain regions of China where coal was the dominant energy source on the grid. So you have to be cognizant of where the energy is coming from, or you're undoing the whole purpose of it. Now, in addition to those air emissions, in that case, burning coal, the electric vehicles require a lot more energy and materials to make than a conventional car. So they use 6 times the amount of materials, all the battery materials, and also not just the battery materials, the lithium, the cobalt, in various factors there, but also because of the battery weight, the average electric vehicle battery weighs about 1,000 pounds. It's really, really heavy. Mm-hmm. And so to offset that, the manufacturers have to use lighter, more expensive materials, different aluminum and other alloys in the frame and in the vehicle to cut weight because they got to offset as much as they can for the weight of that battery. So there's a lot more minerals that go into electric vehicles than a conventional car. So when you look at the embodied energy and you look at the overall embodied CO2 in an electric vehicle, it's much higher when it's coming off the manufacturing lot, right? Mm-hmm. Or off the car lot. Now, over time, and if you're driving it on a grid that is, let's say, powered by nuclear or powered by hydro or powered by natural gas, then yeah, that makes sense. Then you're definitely saving emissions. But most of the world doesn't run on that. Most of the world still runs on coal. So you need to be thoughtful about the timing of this stuff. So we don't want to prematurely scale electric vehicles before we address the energy grid. Otherwise, we're going to end up putting more CO2 in the air than we would have without. So it's a real concern. And a lot of people don't seem to be thinking critically about this problem. They're just rah, as many electric vehicles everywhere as fast as possible. Over half the electric vehicles in the world that are produced are in China, right? So when we see these big numbers everywhere, the millions of new electric vehicles, yeah, they're growing very fast. But 50% of the growth is in China that is predominantly powered by coal, right? So don't get too excited about the environmental benefits of doing that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's just that short-sighted thinking is so crazy when you step back and actually look what the outcomes of that are. And, exactly in that same equation of the saying that comes to mind is trip over $1 to save a penny. When Germany, for example, is trying to protest and decline their use of natural gas, how does that in turn lead to increased CO2 levels?
Because they have to resort to burning more coal. So we're seeing this right now. So the world right now is going back and burning more coal for a variety of reasons. In Europe, it's a lot of the reasons I highlighted earlier, shutting down nuclear, not allowing for natural gas development and fracking development, reliance on energy imports from Russia. There's a convergence of factors that are happening, but the bottom line is they're resorting to coal. Over-dependence, over-investment in renewables and reliance on renewables. So just in the last 12 months, the increase of emissions just due to coal, I'm not talking about the overall, just the increase, that variance, we've wiped out all of the wind and solar benefits of the last 15 years in the US, for example. So think about all the wind and solar projects that have been built over the last 15 years in the US. Globally, with this increase in coal, of those 500 million tons of additional emissions in coal that's being burned, we've just wiped out all of that, right? So that's just the incremental amount. We're still building more. China's building a coal power plant every week, new one, every single week is coming online. So it's not like we're divesting from this, we're ramping it up in many parts of the world. You have countries like India that need it. I mean, 75% of their energy is coming from coal. Their whole economy is intertwined with this precious energy resource. Their train system, the mining industry, the actual energy industry, obviously, as well, of the production of it. This has its tentacles, employs tons of people in India. You turn that off, you're going to have civil unrest, right? What are all the people going to do? So you can't just cut coal off. Otherwise, you descend into darkness and literally stifle all innovation and crush civilization. So yes, we are transitioning, but as you brought up earlier, we're not really transitioning yet. We're still in this additive phase. So we're still burning. When you look at the numbers, like on Our World in Data, you'll look at the numbers. We're still burning as much wood as we did 200 years ago, right? We're not transitioning from wood. We're just added on all of these other technologies. So now we're burning coal and we're burning natural gas and we're burning oil. And now we're using solar panels and we're using wind turbines. And we're just keep adding and adding and adding. But we're not actually transitioning it at all. We're still adding. Mm-hmm. You know, eventually we will, and eventually we will transition from higher emission sources of energy to lower emission. And I think we are. The United States, I think, is the perfect example of this experiment. So the United States has cut its overall CO2 emissions more than any other country on the planet, more than Europe as a whole over the last 15 years, right? And the way we did that is through transitioning through coal to natural gas. So the shale revolution saved more emissions than solar and wind combined. So all of those CO2 is about 1 billion tons of CO2 that were saved in that transition from coal to gas. 61% of that, of those savings, were because of natural gas, because we basically transitioned from coal to gas. About 30% was wind and about 9% was solar. So solar, 9%, gas, 61%, right? Which one is more effective at actually reducing CO2 emissions? I mean, we have evidence of this. We have the example right here, right? So this is what we need to do in other parts of the world. They're not going to be able to transition from coal to solar and wind. That's not going to happen. We know this. And not all places have access to natural gas too. You know, we're blessed here in the US that we have it. In other parts of the world, not so much. So this is why nuclear is a great example of not only ensuring energy security, but because you're not going to be dependent on another country for importing this key fuel, but it's also going to reduce emissions tremendously.
Yeah, it's kind of a funny point that you bring up that we have not transitioned away from burning wood, but you know, in some ways it's somewhat ironic that we've renamed it biomass, just as, you know, we're not heading into recession now, we're going to rename that set of conditions that, you know, used to be called recession.
Yeah, all these terms, things like clean, green, renewable, these are just marketing terms. There's no basis for this, whatever. Solar and wind power are not renewable energy. They're not. I mean, obviously the wind is renewable, but the wind by itself doesn't make energy. You need to have the technology to do that. And these products, these technologies are made from fossil fuels, from toxic chemicals, and all types of other non-renewable sources, right? So what are we talking about? They're not renewable. Plus, you got to throw them away after 20 years and then go dig up all that coal and all those minerals again and go into these very energy-intensive manufacturing processes to things like melt down quartz and add all these chemicals and produce it. So what is renewable about it? I don't see it. I mean, when you're looking comprehensively at the technology, it is completely the world runs 100% on hydrocarbons, 100%, even nuclear, because all of the technologies that in components that go into making nuclear, making solar, making wind are based on hydrocarbons, fossil fuels. You couldn't make it, so therefore the entire world is 100% dependent on fossil fuels.
Mm-hmm. So the last idea, you know, to that point of fossil fuels was that fracking contaminates the water supply and doesn't reduce greenhouse gas emissions. So I think this is a good example of a technology that can easily be misunderstood and demonized by a handful of products that may have had an issue. So is that a fair way to think about it?
So the example I just shared about the most emission reductions in human history of CO2 in the entire world was a result of converting from coal to natural gas. Mm-hmm. So that's where we had the most dramatic savings. So to say that natural gas is going to not be effective is crazy to me, because we have data that is totally contrary to that. I don't see a lot of evidence of water contamination. Now, has the oil and gas industry always been perfect? No, of course they haven't. Mm-hmm. They've made mistakes and they've been getting much better over time. I would say the big issues with the natural gas space right now is methane emissions, right? In flaring, because as you're basically drilling down, some of the gas is getting emitted and some of these old wells are not capped. And so you have this emission issue. But the leaders in the industry are actually getting to what they call net zero emissions by 2025. Like large companies like EQT, which is the US's largest natural gas producer, is setting their goal at net zero by 2025, I believe. So the leaders in the industry are tackling this problem around methane emissions and flaring and all these things. And it's a solvable problem. And plus, they're incentivized not to emit it because that's the product they sell. No one wants to have this natural gas going up into the air when they can make money on that selling it, right? So there's a natural incentive not to waste it. Now, obviously, these things need to be cost effective, but there are cost effective ways to do it. The industry's getting better. They always haven't done a perfect job, obviously, in the past, but that's like all industries, right? Let's even look at solar panels. Like solar panels are incredibly toxic and carcinogenic to produce. They're actually 20 times more carcinogenic than nuclear is because of all the toxicity in the manufacturing process at the plant. So all of these things have various pollution and side effects that we have to keep in mind, and we need to get better on all of them.
Mm-hmm. So, Brian, are there any examples of countries or even states that are producing energy in an optimal way from a grid standpoint?
That's a good question because, unfortunately, I'm not seeing it. France, in some ways, you could make the argument they really led the world in having the most market penetration of nuclear on their grid, about 70%. But they succumb to this same kind of mind virus that many other countries succumb to around the energy transition. Instead of continuing to maintain and invest and continue to build out their nuclear fleet, they said no. In 2015, they passed an energy transition law that basically said that they were going to start slowly divesting from nuclear and investing more in renewables. And because of that, like if you know that a plant is going away, you don't have a lot of incentive to maintain it and continue to invest in it because you know that you're going to be investing in this other thing. So that mentality started shaping the maintenance regime of these plants. And now what we've seen, although they had this tremendous efficient nuclear fleet for many years, you're starting to see it degrade. And now we're having problems in France. So I can't really hold them up as this great model anymore because they succumb to the same bad thinking that many other countries have. I think, ultimately the ideal grid is one that is powered by nuclear and natural gas, right? That's going to be the cleanest burning grid. They have, really good dependencies on each other. Obviously, natural gas is more fast acting and can follow loads. You can deal with the peaks. Nuclear, you're not going to want to overbuild it because of the cost. So there's no reason to overbuild it. So I think those two technologies go really well together. So in some ways, if you totally zoom out, the United States probably is the best example because we've transitioned more to be dominant by natural gas, and we still have 20% of our electricity coming from nuclear. And so I think but that's in the past. That's not looking forward. And I would say the US is lagging behind many other countries in the world in terms of having an energy policy and having an energy plan and charting the future. America doesn't have an energy plan right now. All we have is a big corporate welfare spending bill where we basically are throwing a bunch of money at a bunch of different technologies that aren't going to yield the results that were intended. So that's what we have is basically corporate welfare special interests all feeding at the trough of subsidies.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a great point. And it always seems to come back to incentives, right?
Incentives rule the world. I mean, it's in everything in our personal lives or in business or at the policy level. And I think we put in place a lot of bad incentives in these government policies. And I think the best thing that the government can do in this is really get out of the way and let entrepreneurs and let the market innovate to create these new technologies. But when they put their thumb on the scale, and right now they're going to pump in $240 billion in total subsidies for the wind and solar industry between now and 2031, well, that's putting a big thumb on the scale. That's not a minor thumb. And of course, investors are going to put money into that. Of course, they're going to build a bunch of wind and solar farms when you're getting those kinds of tax credits and those kinds of subsidies, because short-term thinking, you can make money on it, right? In the short term, if you don't care about the stability of the power grid or America's energy security, and you just want to make money short term, there could be plays to be had because of these enormous amount of subsidies that are getting pumped into this industry. But these things are going to have massive side effects in our economy, in our ability to maintain a reliable and resilient electrical grid. And we're already seeing it. We're already seeing the cracks right now. Most of the utilities in the country have issued warnings this summer around concerns around brownouts or blackouts. And we're seeing this erosion of the overall integrity of the electrical grid as we ramp up solar and wind more and more. We could do 5%, 10%, even in some places we could do up to 20%. Once you get over 20% of a grid that's being powered by solar and wind, you're going to start seeing huge issues in terms of reliability, voltage control, resilience, all of these things, and really big exposure. And we're seeing it in Texas, California, who has the highest penetration of renewables. That's where we're seeing this reliability issue show up big time.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's just crazy to think about that. Again, moving to a less efficient and less dense source of power, the ramifications that we can actually see that's having, and yet there's still a big push towards that stuff.
Yeah. I keep shaking my head because it's so frustrating because, we have the solutions, we have the technology, we lack the will. And I think there's 4 things that are leading us down this bad path overall. The first is fear. We're pumping people full of fear around the world, ending around climate change or fear of nuclear power. And fear is a very powerful tool. It's been weaponized since the beginning of humanity. And unfortunately, a lot of the environmental activists and politicians and the media are pumping so much fear into people about this and misinforming them. It's leading us astray. The second is ignorance. We just have the energy system is complicated, right? I mean, it's not an easy thing to understand. Most families and most people, when they come home from work, they want to spend time with their kids or relax. They're not going to educate themselves on all the nuances of how an electrical grid works and energy storage and, what are the nuanced differences between these different technologies. So we have mass ignorance of how this stuff works, right? And then we have this green ideology that is permeated in this, whether it's the ESG framework in the finance community or whether it's permeated our political discussions, this ideology that is driving this decision-making that is incredibly misinformed. And then finally, we have this utopian thinking. We have this belief that we can power industrialized society by using the wind and the sun. And that's clearly not going to happen. But it's this, we have, as humans, I think we have utopian tendencies. We want to live in harmony with nature. It's almost like this Garden of Eden metaphor, right? We want to go back and live in the Garden of Eden in concert with nature. And of course, no one wants to breathe dirty air or drink dirty water. We all want that. But there's much more effective ways to do this by using the appropriate technologies, which are natural gas and nuclear power.
Mm-hmm. Well, Brian, I think that's an excellent place to wrap up today's conversation. Do you have anything else you'd like to touch on before we do?
Well, I would just say if people are interested in these topics and want more of it, they can follow me on Twitter at Brian Gitt. I post pretty frequently, usually multiple times a day. I also write long form pieces on these topics you can subscribe on my website, which is briangitt.com. And those are the best 2 places to find me if you're interested in learning more about this stuff.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, your website and your Twitter are excellent sources of information, and that's Gitt, Gitt. Brian, thanks so much for your time today. Really appreciate you helping us take a little bit of time out of our day to help educate ourselves on the complexity of these energy systems.
I appreciate the invitation. It was a great conversation.
This podcast is for general informational purposes only. Nothing on this podcast should be taken as investment advice. Guests on this show are not compensated for their appearance. Listeners are urged to educate themselves and make their own decisions. Do not base any investment decisions on the information contained. To view our full disclaimer, please visit our website.